Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last session of our racial justice training. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much to Jeremy for hosting us today and throughout this entire series. And so I just want to turn it over to Jeremy for our session today.
Thanks, Kyle, and thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate all of you all who've stuck around for these 8 sessions. We've talked about a lot of different things, really covering all different dynamics of racial justice. We've had conversations with Black women, with young folks, talked about Black males. We've even had conversation about the history of racial oppression and even microaggressions. Today is the finale, the final one. Today, we're going to do a little bit of reflection. You'll see some familiar content because we're talking about that journey from ally to accomplice. And the hope is that over the last couple of months, you all have been able to use the tools presented to you to be on that journey. So for that reason, we're going to reintroduce a few of those concepts that we've introduced to you all beforehand and just kind of reflect on those and use those to articulate what does it mean to go from being an actor to an ally to an accomplice. By the end of the day, you'll get a greater sense of what that looks like. And then in your reflection journals coming out next week, you get a chance to actually practice what that could look like in your own lives. So thank you all for your time today. We thank you all for sticking with us. And like always, we're hoping that this training also is going to be engaging and also is going to help you all continuously do your work as we all are constantly on that journey. Okay, so here is the description for today's conversation. We're going to illuminate the differences between an actor who wants to help people of color and an accomplice who wants to dismantle racism. It provides participants with a framework to identify your level of engagement in racial justice work and recommendations for moving toward racial justice. As always, we look at our community culture, right? We want to make sure we're not doing that toxic positivity, allowing for conversations to get uncomfortable. We're going to make sure that we say things without justifying. We want to make sure that when we're sharing, we do that from our own perspective and that we don't require folks of color to do that as well. Think out loud. We also want to make sure if there's any power dynamics, either between myself and you or other folks while you work today in groups, that those don't exist either. We want to cancel those out. Okay, so I'm going to have you all, even this early, get into some groups. Dr. John Paul is a national speaker on racial justice, and he talks a lot about what it means to go from being an ally to an accomplice. I know it's only 9:08 and it's Friday, but I do want to read Dr. John Paul's sentiments about that, and then I'm going to put you all into groups to just answer 2 questions. Okay. So I'm going to need about 3 or 4 readers this morning. Can I have my first reader to read a quote from L. Follins?
I can read, Jeremy.
Thank you, Ruby.
I want someone to do more than just feel for me. I want someone to do more than just listen to my pain. I want someone to be more than an ally. I want them to be an accomplice. L. Follins.
Thank you, Ruby. Appreciate it. I'm going to have another reader read the next piece.
I'll go ahead.
Thank you.
Being an accomplice means more than just understanding the problem, but being a person with a plan to solve it. It is about understanding that you, as an ally and potentially someone with privilege, have worked to create a foolproof plan to help end systems of oppression.
Whew, that's heavy, isn't it, Patty?
But again, it's very true.
That's the word. Can I have someone new read this third description for me?
I can read it for you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Luther.
The part that is most pivotal in conversations about moving from ally to accomplice is questioning what you are willing to give up. It is about asking yourself, are you willing to lose elements of your privilege to help someone else's life become easier to navigate? More, it is about the contextualizing the way that you stand up and speaking truth when someone else lacks the necessary power to stand on their own.
Wow. And then lastly, kind of a fourth person.
I can read.
Thank you,
Being an
Alyssa.
accomplice is more than just listening to others talk about the struggle. It is also about solidifying a course of action that helps you commit to undoing it.
Thank you, Alyssa. So let's talk a little bit before I put you in your groups. What stands out to you all about Dr. John Paul's sentiment about the difference between being an accomplice and being an ally?
What stands out to me, Jeremy, is that he don't want just a friend that sits and do nothing. He wants somebody that's going to work to help make the change.
Thank you, Ruby. That's good. Yeah. Want someone who's willing to do the work to help make that change. Somebody else.
And to acknowledge that there is white privilege and how you as an individual, if you are a white person, have benefited from that, and that you are willing to give that up so that others can share the fruits of their labors too.
Yeah, Patty, and that's a rough one. I know a lot of white folks coming into the knowledge of the fact that we even have privilege just by being born white that you even act for, and then recognizing all the many ways you've benefited from being white in your own life, even if it was unintentional, and then moving into acknowledging and admitting when you do use your privilege for yourself. All of that is a process that's going to take some time and some practice for folks to really start doing. And then after you've been able to acknowledge the history, recognize that, yeah, you're white as well, right? You benefit from that and admit that you maybe have even used your privilege to your own advantage, then you can start doing the work of saying, wow, how can I begin to dismantle that? How can I begin to address that? And then Dr. John Paul does a great job of saying, listen, it's more than just being an ally and recognizing that there's something wrong. It's about moving to making sure that you no longer have those same privileges at the expense of other people. Sheesh. Is there anyone else who feel like there's something that stands out to them about John Paul's words? All right, I'm going to put you all into groups. In your groups, you're going to answer these two questions. Which elements of your privilege can you give up to help someone else's life become easier to navigate? And what do you think the difference is between an actor, ally, and accomplice? All right, which privileges can you give up? And before I even give you the answer, I want you to think through a little bit. What do you think the differences are between being an actor, an ally, and accomplice? Okay, I'm gonna call it 9:15. We'll do our groups until about 9:20. All right, those two questions. What are you willing to give up? And then what's the difference between an actor and an ally and an accomplice? All right, Kyle, can we put them in the groups?
Yep, they're on their way now.
All right, it looks like the gang's all back together again. I just wanted to know from you all, what do you think is your understanding of an actor, an ally versus an accomplice? Anybody, you can share something that you said, or maybe something that somebody else said that kind of stuck out to you as well. What's the difference to you?
Jeremy, I kind of said that the actor was someone who pretends to want to make changes or to make things work or agree with what your philosophy is about white privilege or no privilege. But they're not doing anything. They're just agreeing, which kind of flowed into being an ally. I'm your friend, but I don't want to make you upset. So yeah, I agree with that. You need help with that? Yeah, that's good, but not doing the work. Not
Gotcha.
getting in there doing the work. But it kind of flowed in there together. So
that's good. Thank you, Ruby. Someone new.
This is Mary. I was in Ruby's group too, but I just threw out there too with the accomplice. When you think of different situations of being an accomplice, usually those people are there when something goes down. So to me, it's like you're willing to be in the trenches. You show up, you're there, you're doing the work. And so they see that you're present and you're rolling up your sleeves.
Got that right. You roll up those sleeves. Somebody else want to add to this conversation?
If I could add something, Jeremy, I think I added in my group chat that I thought actor was a bit performative.
Yeah.
That you kind of know what looks PC, looks good, and are willing to kind of do that, but not dig in further. Ally is a bit passive, where you kind of have that understanding, but maybe aren't as actively engaged in it. And accomplice, I feel like, is like empowering, because you recognize that folks of color, marginalized groups, have their own agency and understanding of the issues, and you're willing to kind of like support that, but not like take up, front and center and make it about you.
Yeah, that's good. So our understanding of those three are really, really good. I appreciate you all. And you all are definitely hitting the nail right on the head, I think. As we think back over the work we've been doing since last year, October, much of that has really been spicing together and really understanding, hey, it's one thing to understand. It's another thing to read about and learn. It's a whole other thing for us to actually start doing that work. And one of the things I always tell folks is going to trainings like these is the doorway to racial justice work. It's the doorway to accomplish work. It is not in and of itself accomplished work, right? And so we'll see some of those distinctions today, and that just learning stuff isn't really being accomplished, right? It's what are you doing with that learning as well. So thank you all for that. Here is the definition of an actor, right? The actions of an actor do not disrupt the status quo. Much of the same as a spectator at a game. Both have only a nominal effect in shifting overall outcomes. The actions of an actor do not explicitly name or challenge the pillars of white supremacy, and actors participate in shallow, performative acts of allyship when they feel comfortable or obligated. Okay? So I want us to all think about a moment in our lives when we have performed as an actor. Is there anyone who is bold enough to talk about a moment in time where they themselves was an actor? Do you want to share that experience with us?
I want to share an experience. This is Edith, by the way. So I know that before any of these trainings and before like college, I would always agree. I was always an agreeer, and it was more because of somebody's feelings. So if somebody was upset about something, I was like, yes, true, I agree. Or yes, I agree. I was very compliant and just like kind of sugarcoating it. I'm like, yeah, I agree. Like I'm taking your feelings into consideration. But it wasn't until I actually learned about something that I feel like I stopped being an actor and actually took it for what it was at face value.
So you just used to be an agreeer, Edith, just being like, yup. So like if someone said climate change was bad, you would just agree. Or if someone said, police brutality was terrible, you would just agree. Is that what you're saying?
If their feelings, before any of this, if their feelings were in it, I'm very sympathetic or empathetic. So I would have been like, oh yes, try to be more comforting and agree. But it wasn't until you actually grasp the gravity of the situation that you stop being an actor.
Until you really understand the real situation, you start doing that work, you start doing more learning, and now you're just going like, yeah, it's bigger than how someone feels. It's actually a thing here. There's a system here. That's good, Edith. That's a good point. Somebody else, talk to us about when you were an actor. And what did it look like for you?
I think sometimes, like I have a Black Lives Matter sign, and I noticed in my neighborhood a lot of people do. And if that's where it stops, if I stopped there, I would just be an actor. It would be like I'm declaring to my neighbors, hey, I'm in the fight, Black Lives Matter, end of story. So I have to take the next step. And the next step might be like going to a march, but only watching the march. Only watching it. Being there, maybe the TV cameras get a picture of me so my neighbors know I'm really serious about this. But then the final step would be for me to actually participate and listen and be a part of what is happening on the street. So I just see that as the sort of the spectrum of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, Susan, and the cool thing is, and even in your reflection journals, and I've even referenced them in the slides too, but there's a lot of websites talking about this kind of stuff, and so you'll have all that context. And what we'll do today is literally give you, I forget the name of the website, but they talk about 12 different ways in which you could be an actor, accomplice, or an ally. And so we'll talk about that, and it is really it is really empowering in a lot of ways to know, like, okay, just putting up a sign is one level, right? Talking to my friends who don't agree with me is another level, right? But actually demonstrating that I believe they matter by being a part of demonstrations and policies and structural change, that's a whole other level, right? And one of the things that I love about you all today is that you're demonstrating, you get that there's levels to this thing, and we're trying to be, I like to say, you want to do all three of them, right? You want to do all three of them. Don't be performative, but definitely take a stance, be involved, keep learning, and then also figure out ways you can contribute to structural change. Is there anybody else want to talk about a moment? This is good. So we got signs in the front yard. It's like, yeah, you're an actor. Anybody can put up a sign, right? Just being agreeable, without actually having information or understanding. Another way of being an actor. Somebody else want to talk about another time in their life when they were an actor, and what did it look like? All right, we're going to move along, okay? So here are, in our training, we talked about this before, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, but we talked about some of those habits of actors, okay? And so on the left-hand side, you're going to see 5 different habits, and then on the right-hand side, you're going to see the definitions. All I want you all to do is I'm going to pull out one of those habits, starting with moral license, and I want you all to tell me which one of those definitions goes best with it. Some folks may not realize this, but all 5 of these things and some more really are indicators that you're an actor, because you may be doing these things repetitively and not looking for anybody to hold you accountable. Okay, so these are the types of things that actors do without any sense of wanting accountability. All right, so let's play this game for a moment here. The first one I'm going to pull out is moral licensing. Someone tell us which one of those definitions best fits this one.
I think minimizing harm you've caused towards people of color because you've performed acts of allyship and solidarity in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. That's perfect. Yep, and Alyssa agrees with you, Samantha. So when we talk about moral licensing, I like to say people are sometimes white folks and or allies or actors, what they'll do is it's kind of like cashing in on chips. Every time I do something in solidarity with the racial group, whether it be Mexican Americans or Asian Americans, I'm cashing that stuff into myself. Nobody knows it, but I'm kind of collecting all of my coins of solidarity. And whenever someone says to me, you know what, you seem to be taking up too much space, I get offensive and I go, not me. I know all about sharing space. I've marched. I've done this, I've done that. And so what that's called is moral licensing, like Samantha said. You're trying to minimize the harm you've caused just because you did something in the past, right? And the issue with this is, as an ally, you always want to place yourself in a position of accountability. You never want to put yourself on a pedestal that says that you can't be approachable. Then you become an actor. Folks realize that you're only here so that can't nobody hold you accountable. Any questions or thoughts, particularly about moral licensing? What are some ways you can respond to someone if they start doing some moral licensing? Anybody have any ideas? How can you respond when someone starts doing that? Minimizing the harm they've caused, shouting out all the time they were a good ally, quote unquote, instead of taking accountability. What can you do?
This is Patty. I don't know what you could do. I would suspect that whatever it was would not be warmly welcomed by the person.
Yeah, Pat, you got a good point. A lot of times when folks are moral licensing, usually that conversation is heated. Sometimes it's emotional. People are crying or they're upset or they're in comment sections and they're defending themselves, or they're calling out other folks of color and saying, why aren't you defending me? Right? One of the things that we recommend when someone is moral licensing is really to make sure You don't rescue them. We talked about in our microaggressions training, don't rescue them from that, or don't try to make other people lay off of them and be like, you know what, you all, Patty didn't mean it. It's okay. She's right. She's been a part of our training. She's been a part of our things. Don't do that. Right? You never want to rescue white folks from being held accountable to how they show up in spaces that are meant to liberate other people. You always want to allow them to sit in that space. And what you also want to do is, maybe they're not willing to listen today, right? You can also take stance and say, listen, until you're willing to have a conversation on accountability, we can no longer accept you in these spaces because you cause them to be unharmful, right? Anytime someone's throwing back into your face how they've helped you, they actually haven't helped you. They've been more of a spectator, right? And so you really want to make sure you create safe spaces where folks aren't doing that. You have to be held accountable. And if you're not willing to be held accountable, then we can't hold space with you. The third thing is, white folks really want to move in that space. If you are truly an ally or an accomplice, you're going to be the one that says, listen, the way you showed up today was unacceptable. As a white person with power and privilege, I'm using mine to call you out on your power and privilege. And I want to make sure you recognize that. And I want us to work together to figure out how to repair harm. Because that moral licensing didn't do good for nobody, right? And so really white folks really attacking that situation, maybe not the person, but the comment or the sentiment, and really helping them figure out if this is the space they want to be in. And then make a plan to repair harm before entering back into that space, okay? And so maybe it's talking to leaders of demonstrations or organizations or persons being harmed and saying, what will make you feel more comfortable in this space with that person, right? And they may tell you, they may say, listen, I don't want to talk about it, but what you never want to do is allow someone to cause harm without white folks really holding them accountable. Don't put that burden of accountability on folks of color. Any other thoughts about moral licensing?
Jeremy, this is Mary. There was a situation I had just a few days ago with one of my siblings, and I've been doing a lot of work in the tribal communities. And at some of the talks, my sister was present, and they had talked about the boarding schools and stuff. And so later, a few days later, we were at home doing something, and she brings out, I wish they would look forward instead of backwards, because they keep going to the trauma, and I wish they'd look forward. She's like, I don't dwell on the Holocaust, the German Holocaust that affected my ancestors. And I couldn't even, I just, in my head, I'm standing there and going, what the F? I couldn't even respond. I was so distraught. I had to walk away from her. And then later in the day, I went to my two other sisters and I said, I don't know if she's watching QAnon. I was just like, I don't know what's going on. And it just really upset me. I mean, I lost sleep over it and everything. So I need to go back and approach her. And I felt like I didn't even have the tools. It was like, where do I even go with this? Because the election did tear my family apart. We have, it really tore it apart bad, and we're still like trying to regroup from that. And we have people that are, so it's like, wow, this continual fight. And it's like, I just feel like saying, where the F are you getting your information? Like, where did this come from? And it just, so I couldn't even respond. I was so just, I don't know. It still's got me pretty shaken up.
Yeah, Mary. And one of the things I always tell folks is, especially white folks who want to have conversations with family, many times they're the ones who can shake us up the most because they're so close to us. I want to encourage you to keep going back, keep having those conversations. Now that you know your siblings' understanding of the situation, how they view it, you recognize that even though they can be close to it, they're still basically in that actor stage. That stage of being like, that actually was an example of white centering your lived realities at the expense of other folks. Now that you know that, you have some work that can be done. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to definitely potentially get worse before it gets better. But you never want to claim to be doing this work in solidarity and also not doing this work at home, right? And so that is a part of that accomplice work, risking your power and your privilege, your comfort, and your relationships, just to make sure folks understand that you're committed to dismantling that white centering, looking at someone else's oppression through the lens of your own oppression, right? So I just want to encourage you to keep in that, stay doing that, and being upfront and not minimizing or being agreeable as well. That's good. Okay, so let's keep moving. Tone policing, which one of these best goes with that?
People with power and privilege silencing people of color and ignoring their demands because they don't like the person of color's tone or a voice. Okay,
Right. Tone policing happens all the time, especially when we talk about social media. This is an amazing platform for white folks to do all sorts of kinds of tone policing. You see that a lot. It's going to be important that we recognize that when it comes to historic racism, disenfranchisement, oppression, and suppression, folks ought to be upset, pissed off, and angry. Like, I don't know, you get angry for less, right? When you think about what makes you mad, someone cutting you off in traffic, or taking too long in the line, or someone cursing at you today. All of those things make you mad right now. And so we recognize that anger can be righteous anger. It can be justifiable anger. It can be anger at historical oppression. And we have to make room for that and making sure that we don't see that as something that's problematic. Yeah, you're going to be uncomfortable. Maybe they're going to offend you. Potentially you may be in situations where you feel unsafe, but recognizing that rage when it comes to racial injustices is definitely appropriate because the history of it proves to us that we aren't done yet, right? But there's folks in this country like me and other people of color and marginalized identities who have to live this thing out. And so, yes, people will be upset. And sometimes they have personality or ethnic-based mannerisms that go with it. Never want to put somebody in a position to have to change or assimilate to how you want them to act in order for them to be authentic. So no tone policing, all right? Any questions or thoughts about tone policing? All right, what is white silence? Someone new.
It's I think it's when white people choose not to speak up, hold other white people accountable.
Yup, Anna, Luca, thank you both.
Sorry.
Yeah. So that white silence, there's actually a handout that I've given you all over the months that talks about reasons why white folks are silent and reasons when you should and should not silence. Okay, when folks of color are having conversation about what we could be doing better for our communities, that is a time for you to be silent. You don't want to take up space in that way. But when white folks are having conversations, for an example, that may be harmful to communities, that's a time for you to speak up. And to speak up, dip into their conversation. You want to do everything you can to make sure folks understand some truth and can really, I say, call them up instead of calling them out, right? So call them up and say, hey, listen, I heard the conversation, and here's some things I want you to think about if you want to be a better ally, right? Actors are the ones who stay silent at times when they should speak up, and then speak up at times when they should be silent. Is there any questions about being or white silence at all? All right, keep it moving. What is optical allyship? Can I have someone new match that one together for me?
When allies engage in surface level support of marginalized groups without commitment to unlearning their prejudice or contributing to tangible change.
Yes, thank you, Kate. That's exactly it. When it looks good, I'll figure it out. And then lastly, white centering is centering white stories, values, norms, feelings, and perspectives over the needs and interests and realities of communities of color. Okay, that is white centering, and that can happen in 1,000 different ways. An example that was given earlier around the sister comparing Native American or indigenous folks' histories of oppression, folks who are of Jewish ethnic background, that is white centering. Although both of those groups experience oppression, you never want to center your experiences at the expense of other folks. Allow them to talk about their experiences, and everybody who experienced oppression has the right to call on history to ensure that that history doesn't repeat itself. All of that matters. Any questions or about white centering or comments? Okay, so these are the habits of folks who are just actors. They constantly engage in all of these things and don't want anybody to hold them accountable. We want to make sure that as we do our work, we move from this stage. We have to move from this stage of being an actor, okay? And so we have to make sure we hold ourselves accountable to not doing those things. This next piece, you all may remember, we looked a little bit at Martin Luther King, and what I want to do is bring that back up for us, constantly reaffirming the role that history plays. Now, a lot of times when we see black and white photos, we think to ourselves it was a long time ago, but it actually wasn't. I think I read somewhere that if Martin Luther King was alive today, he'd be like 80 or something, right? He'd be like a grandparent of somebody's. And so this is like recent information. And so his time period is also very much so recent in history as well. Here's what he says when we talk about an actor. He says, first, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate who was more devoted to order, quote unquote, than to justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Okay, let that sink in for a little bit. And here's the first question. What three attitudes did Dr. King consider gravely disappointing about white moderates? Somebody talk to me. 3 attitudes.
Order rather than justice.
Yeah, Brianna, order, the attitude that I just want order rather than justice, okay? What's the second attitude?
This just really isn't a good time.
Yeah, that's, yeah, everything is about timing. Oh, timing, let's wait a little bit. Let's wait a little bit, right? What's the third one? It's in the center.
Agree with you, but I don't like your methods.
I agree with you, but I don't like how you're doing it. Ruby, you're on point. Yeah. So this actor is saying, listen, I am literally saying, I want order, right? And I don't agree with what you're doing, and I want you to wait. It happens all the time in our society. Folks are saying, I don't like when you burn down buildings. I don't like when you march and interrupt traffic. I don't like how, or you all should understand that your demands that you're making are too big. Make them smaller and give them bite size so that we can digest them. Or think about it for a little bit longer. Is that something you really want to do, right? People are dying in the street and have been doing so since the dawn of this country. And you're telling that same group of people who have been waiting for and working for justice to continuously wait, right? We want to wait less in line. Like I said before, we're less patient waiting for a movie we want to see. And you're telling me to be patient about making sure our lives are not taken in the street? No, ain't nobody gonna do that, right? So Martin Luther King, once again, draws the attention to those attitudes. But here's the second conversation I want us to have, though. Why is it problematic for white people to prioritize order over justice?
I imagine order is just a substitute for like the status quo and like continuing white supremacy and privilege.
Ooh, Constance, you're talking about something now. Yeah, that status quo for just white supremacy. Somebody else, what's the problem with prioritizing order over justice?
I would say, especially recently with the riots, if you're prioritizing order, you're prioritizing the value of businesses and property over the value of lives and equality.
Come on, Luca, that's exactly it. Yeah, that order over justice is really kind of a signal that we're looking to keep things as they are. Don't make nobody uncomfortable while you do your thing. And then lastly, what is Dr. King telling us about what it means to be an actor? doing a little bit of critical thinking here. What is he saying about what it means to be an actor?
You don't want anything messy.
Yeah, you don't want anything messy. Chat box release, yeah. It's time to step it up, white people, of course. Somebody else, what is he saying?
I think that actors are preventing change from happening, and they're a bad influence on like fellow white people because they'll just catch on to that attitude of agreeing but not actually taking any action.
Yeah.
And like just becoming so complacent that they're upholding institution rather than helping individuals.
Yeah, Anna, it's so important. You know, in my trainings, I try not to even use the term implicit bias. I recognize that it's been studied thoroughly, but I like to use the term interpersonal bias. And the reason why is because implicit bias, sometimes white folks take that as, I can't help it, it's what I do. And I don't want to ever give anybody a stance or the opportunity to say, to chuck it up to, is just kind of how I'm wired, right? I'd rather talk more about those things that we look at and we say, you know what, interpersonally, I got some bias against these folks in these situations at this time in my life. And I think another thing about an actor from Martin Luther King's perspective is they seem to have this bias toward comfortableness, right? Representation. Right. They may even say, you know, there's enough folks talking about that. Let's pick a different issue. Right. And it's going to be so critical that we don't allow folks to find ways to create excuses for themselves. This is good, y'all. So here is what I want to do next. The whiteaccomplices.org, also in your reflection journals, does this cool thing where they categorize actions in 12 different areas of our lives according to being an actor, an ally, or an accomplice. So I adapted that, right? Some things I kept, some things I really began to moderate. They say on their website that it's a collective contribution, so really helping folks use this as a tool. All right. So here's some examples of what it means to be an actor in community. Talking with interested and like-minded white people in your personal life about racism and whiteness. Only talking to folks who you know want to have the conversation. That's what we call acting. Okay. It's called preaching to the choir. Right? You aren't trying to change your community. You're only finding a subculture or a subset of folks within your community to be comfortable with. Okay. The next one, when it comes to money, donating to political candidates or organizations that use racial justice language, but are not led by directly impacted individuals. And so now we're saying, listen, they use the language, but they're not actually in the work. You know, there's a lot of organizations that came out with statements last year after the George Floyd incidents, and everybody's talking about what all they want to do and stuff. That's just language. Nobody's impressed by language. Nobody wants to follow up with language. Some of us was when it happened, but we've learned better. And that actors oftentimes, and white folks who donate to these organizations or political candidates, they're doing that, but they haven't really researched if that organization or candidate is committed to that work for real, okay? Then there's protesting, attending marches and vigils that are comfortable and perhaps even fun, led by white people, okay? So an example that I always use, and folks get upset, is when you see like white folks in the suburbs painting Black Lives Matter on the ground. And I'm just like, y'all could be doing a lot more with your privilege than painting the ground, right? And so even though it's fun, even though it's a fad, even though it's cool, when it comes to being white and contributing to racial justice, we need you all to do far more than follow a fad. Right? Then follow something that's been happening. We need to want, especially in mostly white communities, it's some folks y'all could be really making upset with your marching and your knocking on doors and your canvassing than you could be painting the ground. And so it's a critical conversation around, are you just doing it because it's led by white people, you feel comfortable, or are you doing it because you really think it is going to affect actual change? Okay? That's going to be critical. There's also education. Reading, watching films, and reviewing articles about diversity and racism when you want to. right? We've all read a book that we didn't finish, watched a movie that we went to sleep on. It's kind of like only engaging in the conversation whenever you feel like it. It's completely different than actually engaging in conversations despite the way you feel. Okay? Advocacy. Engaging social media posts, advocating on behalf of policies being put forth by racial justice organizations. And so this one is just simply like sharing stuff or liking things, making a comment here or there. And some folks think that they're really doing great work because they're doing that. And there's some validity to it. But the idea here is that you're sitting on your phone, probably laying down in your bed, liking and sharing stuff, right? Your privilege was not impacted by that post or share. Although someone may add to the discourse, somebody else may get aware of what's going on. Remember, your privilege was not directly dismantled because of that engagement, right? And so actors sometimes use social media as a highlight reel for agreeableness in the conversation, but they're actually not living that out in their everyday lives. It's the same as you walking up to someone homeless and taking a picture or video of yourself, giving them food, and being like, I did something good today. But why though, right? Did you do it because you wanted to be seen? What is that? There's that actor part of it all. And so we want to make sure that just as much as you're sharing stuff, you're also doing that in your real life, okay? Time and volunteering. Volunteering at a service-oriented organization. This can lead, if you're not doing your work and you're just an actor and you're volunteering your time, it oftentimes can lead to this white savior complex. Being like, you know what, I want to go feed the hungry or clean up a low-income neighborhood. All of those little things we've learned over the years are things that can contribute to white folks who haven't done their work, being like, I feel good about me because I helped some poor community, right? And what we don't want to do is have that attitude of, look at what I did today. Nope. So when you're volunteering your time as an actor, you're looking for stuff like that. And you're being like, I did good today, right? We'll talk about what it means as an ally to do that kind of volunteer work and what it means as an accomplice and how they volunteer. Different stuff going on there, okay? All right, intervening. Actors observe intimidation, harassment, and violence against persons of color by another white person or police officer. Literally, they just observe. They go, wow, that sucks. Or wow, that should have never happened. Right? That's the most that they're going to do. And usually they do it through social media. Some video that they share, they may caption it, you know, we have to stop this, Black Lives Matter, right? But there is more work to be done, even in those instances where you could risk your livelihood and even your life in the same way that folks of color are doing every single day. One of the questions I always ask white folks who want to be engaged in the work is, why is it okay for us to die for the cause, but not for you? Right? Hard questions, but remember, we're separating the allies, the actors, and the accomplices. And there's a huge separation, okay? So yeah, actors, they just observe stuff. Art. Consuming, enjoying, or purchasing art in all forms produced by non-white people or showcasing diversity. It's like watching movies that have Black leaders in it, or you know, buying paintings because there's Black people on them, right? Jobs, taking jobs without concerns for their diversity or their commitment to challenging institutional racism, right? I recognize folks need jobs, right? And I empathize with that, honestly. But now we have to take it up another level and make sure we're asking questions, even in the interview process, around if they are committed to diversity, equity, and or inclusion, and if they have a stance on internalized racism, right, or institutional racism, right? That's going to be critical. And if we're not asking those questions, we're just taking jobs, then we might just be in that actor phase, just kind of needing the job, taking the job, and not really caring about how that institution can directly impact folks of color. Politics, voting for Democrats because they're Democrats, or candidates representing historically marginalized communities Ensuring that the reading material you provide your children have diverse characters or protagonists of color. This is something that became really popular when folks started sharing out that I think 3% of all children's books have folks of color in them, or even come from that narrative. And so as an actor, yeah, you make sure your children read those books, right? But we'll talk a little bit more about how to really help children get engaged in this work in a way that is beyond reading books. And then at home, putting up Black Lives Matter signs in your windows, on your line, inside your car, or wearing woke clothing. Okay, all of that, if you leave it there, like someone said earlier, you're just doing that actor's work. All right. Any questions or comments about the actor? Is anyone confused or feel a little challenged by some of these things? You didn't realize that they were going to be in the actor category potentially?
Jeremy, I just want to make a statement to say that I don't want the white people to feel like they're the only ones that are actors. There are very many people of color that will put that sign up but won't get out there and do anything either.
Woo, Ruby, you're talking. That's good. So Ruby, you and I being African-American folks can have a lot of conversation about what the real role of African-American folks is in dismantling white supremacy culture. Some people believe, some African-Americans believe that Black folks should focus more of their time on building safe spaces for Black folks to exist without harm, and then equipping white folks to dismantle white supremacy spaces where they do cause Black folks harm, right? And so in that viewpoint, many African-American folks would do these things as well, or maybe don't, but they're also spending more of their time. For example, instead of putting out Black Lives Matter signs, they may be creating safe spaces at work for just them and other African-American folks to process police brutality, right? So the question becomes, as folks of color, and this is debatable, or at least a conversation, what is our role in dismantling white supremacy versus building up safe spaces for Black folks and other folks of color to exist outside of that marginalization, right? And so, yeah, you make a great point. Some Black folks aren't doing much, but they could argue, is this even my fight? Because I didn't create it, should I be the one burdened with having to dismantle it, right? Other Black folks like me are saying, listen, I believe that, and I believe I can contribute as well. I can use my skills, my time, and my talent to actually move the work forward. But I also don't put no shame on Black folks who don't want to engage in this work in the same way that I want to, because I recognize that sometimes the trauma of just being a person of color is something that folks are literally trying to manage in their everyday lives, right? And so that's an interesting conversation, and I think both of them are righteous conversations. Thank you, Ruby. That's good. Let's get active, but let's also not put all the burden on folks of color, balancing those two things out. I see some folks are definitely challenged, and we ain't even got through the last two parts of this. Yeah, I was reading this and really conceptualizing this and trying to say, man, I wonder where it is that I've been an actor, right? And I also wonder where it is that other folks may find themselves too. Is there anything on here that you all want to call out? Like, I've been doing this and I'm eager to kind of do more than just that.
I definitely want to learn more about the reading material for children. So I have a little niece that I read books to, and sometimes there's like diverse characters in the book. I think that's so cool. But I never thought about like how that would, just be acting. I don't have to like feel good about myself for reading a book with a diverse character to her, and what more I can do for her.
Yeah, Anna, you bring up a really good point, because at some point in history, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, having Black books was considered the like apex, right? It was, whoa, you're thinking progressive. But once someone told me this, as we continue along this journey of accomplished work, we have to continuously raise the standard, right? The standard for what it means to fight against white supremacy and or do accomplished work cannot be the same 20 years from now as it was 20 years ago, right? So one day we're going to run into something we thought was totally out there and we were being complete accomplices and find out the bar has been raised because progress is being made, all right? All right, any other thoughts before we move on?
Can you expand on the voting?
Yeah, so when we talk about voting, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, the same slide comes up for accomplices and for allies. But the idea here is, number one, considering that we recognize the polarization in Democrats and Republicans. We get that piece, right? But we'll talk about it a little bit later. Sometimes folks think just because someone is a Democrat that they're not racist. Or just because someone is a Democrat, that they have the best interest of marginalized communities in mind. And that ain't true. You being a Democrat doesn't necessarily make you more for anti-racism than anybody else. So it's going to be deeper in going into, well, what are your stances on historical marginalizations, right? And so the representing historically marginalized communities, sometimes we think just because somebody is Black that they're the best candidate, right? And if when in the Black community, we've been processing a lot about what it means to not just get representation by skin color, but to actually get anti-racist folks in there that are willing to do the work and have the conversation, right? Willing to call things out and risk their own social political standing for the well-being of the larger community that voted for them. All right. Did that answer your question, Emily?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's another challenging one too. All right, y'all. For the sake of time, let's keep moving. So here is the definition of an ally. Okay? An ally. Is there any other questions or thoughts for me before we move on? Oh, I see in the chat box. Here we go. I don't feel the need to call these things out. The things on this list are generally good as long as we approach them with awareness. That's exactly it. No. So, Randy, please be clear with me. I'm not saying that you should, I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm saying that they're the start. And that some people do these things because they're trying to be allies. And a large group of folks may do these things without having the historical context or the personal commitment to doing anti-racism work, okay? And so there's a distinction there with being an actor. And some of us do these things. We said that already, and that's okay. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying the reason why you engage matters as much as what you're doing, okay? So if I read a book to my 8-year-old niece that has African-American children in it, have I looked at myself and said, that's all I need to do with her? No. Right? It has to go beyond seeing skin color and understanding why skin color has shaped our lives the way that it has. Okay? So that's important. Any questions or thoughts for me about that that last segment before we move into allies? All right. Here's the definition of an ally. And I actually have 3 different takes on it. So Harvard University says it this way. For social justice and bias trainings, becoming an ally is one of the first actionable items presented. Becoming an ally does not happen overnight. It is a process of self-awareness and work toward unlearning social constructs. Work toward unlearning social constructs. An ally is asked to accept that mistakes may be made along the way and commit and commit to continuing their education every day, okay? And so literally by the Harvard University definition, those of you all who are participating in training like these, this is a great start, right? You could have just only been talking to people who you knew cared about it, but showing up to spaces like these is a great indicator that you're really working on that allyship. That's important. All right, we also have Emil, and I believe I'm saying that incorrectly, forgive me, Lamont's Guide to Allyship said it this way. Anyone has the potential to be an ally. Allies recognize that though they're not a member of the invested and or oppressed communities they support, and make a concerted effort to better understand the struggles every single day. Because an ally may have more privilege and recognizes said privilege, they are powerful voices alongside oppressed ones. And then lastly, being an ally is about recognizing your privilege, using it in a solidarity with marginalized groups to challenge the status quo. It involves working through discomfort, listening, and learning from mistakes. But you can remember before we talked about those actors, they weren't in some parts willing to learn from their mistakes. They were tone policing and white centering, and they didn't really care for the dialogue. They kind of had these habits that they weren't trying to grow out of. And then we talked about all the many ways people can do things that look like allyship, but depending on your motive, your understanding, and your commitment to the work, you could just be doing those things as an actor. Just doing it to say you did it, not looking forward to real change or dismantling your own privilege, okay? So hopefully these examples of what allyship looks like from these three different sources help us to further distinguish those changes. Any questions or comments? What stands out to you all about these definitions?
What stands out to me is the definition in the green, where it's asked to accept the mistakes, or that mistakes may be made along the way. So like understanding that it is a continuous process of learning, and like you're not automatically perfect if you decide to become an ally.
Yeah, that's good. Anybody else?
I am really struck by the text in red, because I don't think that because I am not part of this group that I really can make much of a difference, or that I have a powerful voice. So this kind of surprises me.
Oh, the last sentence, because an ally might have more privilege and recognizes said privilege, they are powerful voices alongside oppressed ones.
Yes, I often think about when I'm in this training, well, but you know what, I haven't had these experiences. I don't know what this is like. I have this white privilege. How can I possibly contribute anything because of that?
Yeah, Patty. One of the things it says is that you recognize your privilege, right? Once you recognize your privilege and you're committed to not leading, but just standing alongside oppressed folks, you can use that privilege to help them get a little bit further along. See, a lot of times we stop at just being like, I got privilege, but we haven't done that deep-rooted work of saying, what are all the ways that my privilege shows up in my life? And then how can I use it to dismantle my privilege alongside other folks, right? And so if you think about, you know, all the many ways you could have privilege, the jobs you have, economic standing, education, resources, relationships, the question becomes, have you tapped into those things in order to really make a better world for somebody else? Have you actually leveraged your own privilege as an individual for that work? Many times white folks focus on being silent or not being in the way. Allyship says, let's go a little bit further and try to figure out how we can be a partner in a way that doesn't prioritize us, but that we can use our white privilege to make sure we prioritize marginalized groups. Okay, so there may be an opportunity for anybody to really reflect on if they've actually assessed all the ways they have privilege and looked at how many ways they can use those privileges to better benefit marginalized communities. Does that make sense, Patty?
Yes. How do you know? How do you figure that out? I mean, I know how to analyze my white privilege and the things that came easier for me, et cetera, but how do I move to the next step and say, this is how I can use this to move to the next level? How do you do that?
That's a question you're going to have with other folks or other white folks around how you all can do that work. Yep. I told y'all this is going to challenge you. I told you. We're going to really go deeper. Okay. Many times we use these terms, but we haven't really challenged ourselves to embody them or understand where we are within them. And that's okay. Okay. And I also want to say this, these things are less, they aren't like set sections. They kind of blend into each other. You move into the next one. Okay. Like we said before, some of us are definitely realizing it's not just good enough to be empathetic. Okay. Or it's not just good enough to understand, I should say. It's not just good enough to understand that somebody's having a struggle or know intellectually that you should be more diverse. Let's go a little bit further than that. Let's talk about actually using some of that privilege to dismantle the other part of that privilege, right? And assessing that stuff. That's going to be critical. Because when we talk about accomplices who are working to literally dismantle systems of oppression, you can't get there until you realize where you are in this system of oppression.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yep. So I'm trying to scaffold our learning today, but I want you all to go along on this journey and challenge yourself. Is there anybody else? Is there anything else that stands out to us about these definitions about allyship? Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, I just wanted to chime in. I love that all of these acknowledge that there will be mistakes made along the way. Like there is no expectation that you are going to be perfect at this off the bat. Like it's about trying and it's about being in there and being in the work and doing your best.
Rebecca, guess what? You're facilitating and I love it. Okay. So let's say you're in a situation where you're trying to do some of your ally work. You know, you realize like, I got to do more than just this actor stuff. I got to go deeper, do it for a bigger reason than just me feeling good or whatever it may be, right? And you're doing this work, and sometimes you may get called out. And as an actor, you may not want to be called out, and you may try to run from it, and you may deny it. But as an ally, you learn how to address the harm, and sometimes you got to do it quickly. And say, listen, in this conversation, in this group, we're doing stuff, we're moving, we're acting a little, not acting, we're doing actions. And you may say something, do something, realize something, be in a space, taking up too much of it. Here's some things you can do very quickly to acknowledge that you maybe have showed up in a way and you maybe have made a mistake. Saying something like, I hear you. Right? You may be in a conversation, just like Patty just did to me. And she's really working with me to figure out, like, okay, well, how do I move from one stage to the next? As soon as it clicks, she says, oh, I got it. Right? That's the kind of allyship that separates an ally from an accomplice in some ways, is that you're able to work through it until you understand it. And maybe you go off and you talk to somebody else and you don't burden me with having to explain it for a very long time, but you're working to hear someone. You're not always focused on being heard, like the actor who did some what's the term? I'm forgetting the term now. The actor who does some moral licensing, they're trying to be heard. They want folks to acknowledge and give them a badge of honor and say, yeah, you did good today. Nope. When you move to the allyship, you're trying to hear folks. Right? Not only can you say, I hear you, but you can also say, I'll reflect on that. And really do it. Think about it this way, y'all. Do you have a journal dedicated to reflecting on your own privilege? Just think about it. Do you have prayers, if you believe in prayer and meditation, and if you have a higher being, that dedicate themselves to saying to your God, I want, even on a spiritual level, to embody what it means to dismantle white supremacy and create equity? Are there prayers you can pray? Certainly in the Quran or the Bible or whatever books you may read or ancient texts, there might be some that surround themselves around justice, voice, and caring for those who cannot care for themselves, holding folks of power accountable. There's text out there that may be in alignment with your belief system that you can reflect on and pray about it and chant to yourself or put on your wall as an affirmation. Today I will, ... Right? How are you tangibly reflecting on dismantling white supremacy culture and or reflecting on how you can contribute to creating safe spaces for people of color to heal from the harm of oppression? Think about it. I did that. I was in the training before I partnered with Serve Wisconsin. I was in the training. And someone had just gotten killed by the police. I forget which person it was. And I started talking to some of my African-American friends and said, I want to do more. Like, I'm going to marches and all of that kind of stuff, but I want to do more. And I started praying about it. And I started creating content that I can create. This is my gift. I'm a trainer by trade, right? Presentation designer by trade. So I said, God, how can I use the gifts that I have, the career that I have, to actually help somebody dismantle white supremacy culture and create safer spaces for folks of color? But it came out of reflection, okay? And so take time to really prioritize these kinds of conversations in your mind and in your spirit, and potentially even in your religious practices where it may fit. All right, I appreciate your feedback. That's something you can say really quickly, but the reason why I put it up here is because the appreciation for feedback is what makes a good ally, okay? Appreciating feedback is critical. Wanting it, hearing it, reflecting on it, but saying, you know what, my attitude is if I can get some feedback from a peer of mine or from someone who has represented some marginalized communities, I'll take it because I'm open and I want it, right? I'm thankful for the information. That's another attitude adjustment, right? New information and being thankful for it. Sometimes as we're transitioning and we're continuously raising the bar, stuff gets old. Concepts get old. I'll give you an example. Back in the day when we used to do, in Public Allies, we used to do something called the Privilege Walk, or like I believe it's called the Privilege Walk, where we all stand in line, diverse groups of people, and then we would step up if we've had these privileges in our lives. Well, nowadays, folks are saying we don't want to do that walk no more. Why? Because after 10, 20 years, what we've learned is folks who don't have those same privileges, what can happen is you find yourselves reliving the trauma of historical oppression by doing the privilege walk. Not only that, but we're now also calling out all the many ways that someone who doesn't have privilege is actually sitting and it's being open and on display for other folks to see. And so when we talk about confirmation bias or confirming stereotypes, that game, if not facilitated well, can definitely reaffirm a stereotype about a group of people, right? And it can cause folks to look at folks in a monolith because they're still there. And so rather than focusing on who doesn't have privilege, let's focus on how to dismantle the privilege that folks do have, right? That's the difference. And so nowadays, people are saying, we don't want to do the privilege walk. We want to replace that with something that focuses the change agents or the conversation on dismantling white supremacy culture, as opposed to looking at who doesn't have privilege altogether. That's just an example about new information and how it should shift how we do our work. And so that's why we should be thankful for it. Okay? And then admitting I may have caused harm. Okay? That's going to be critical. Always being very critical and saying, listen, I may have caused harm and I admit to that and I want to acknowledge that, right? These are some ways as an ally you show up. Okay? Any questions or thoughts? Are there any one of these you want to start doing more often, saying more often? Are there any one of these you all feel like you should do more often when you're engaged in dialogues or experiences as an ally?
I like the I'll reflect on that. So my thought with the I'll reflect with that and I appreciate your feedback is it still feels kind of dismissive. As opposed to like I may have caused harm. You're like actually taking more responsibility on it. And so I guess do those two seem dismissive?
They
Other
can
people?
be if you say that in a dismissive way, right? And remember, this is addressing harm, not repairing harm, and we're doing it quickly, right? So in context, you may be you may have gone to a demonstration, Alyssa, and afterwards someone says, "Hey, talk to me. I want to talk to you for a moment." During the demonstration, you were yelling at the microphone, and although you were invited to, maybe you can consider next time, like giving the microphone to somebody else of color so that they can do all of the chanting. You may say to them, "Wow, I never thought about that. I think I'm going to definitely, I appreciate your feedback for that for sure." Right. And so the point I'm making here is that in context of a conversation, these things may actually work really well. And they can actually, if you mean them, they can definitely help folks understand that you're not being dismissive. You're actually leaning into it as well. Does that make sense, Alyssa?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else. Questions, thoughts?
I think the "I may have caused harm" piece is something I want to work on, just because I feel like I feel like everyone doesn't want to acknowledge when they've done something that they didn't mean to do necessarily, because they don't want to be seen as like the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's definitely something, like, I need to acknowledge like my own missteps, and I think not many people do say, "I may have caused harm," or "I misspoke there. I didn't know that those words carried that weight," or something like that.
Thank you, Sophia. Is there a few others? Someone else, and when I was doing this training for someone else, they were saying they really appreciated "I hear you." Sometimes what happens is when we're being called out, we say a lot of, "I didn't mean it that way. I was misunderstood. That's not what I meant," right? And we start trying to make folks get what we meant as opposed to taking what we actually said. And so in moments where you feel like people misunderstand you, even if you don't say it exactly like "I hear you," having the attitude and the demeanor of listening is going to be critical. And someone shared that, and I thought that was really powerful, that for those of us who may be easily offended, and we're working on that, practice telling people, "You know what, I'm listening. I hear you," right? Because that's really what you're doing. You're really hearing. You're not just listening to what they're saying to respond. You're hearing them. And you may finish the sentence. "I hear you when you say X, Y, or Z." Or "Something I'm reflecting on is X, Y, or Z." Or "I appreciate that feedback because I've never considered X, Y, or Z," right? And so these are just starts. And they could be whole sentences or the start of a sentence where you really expound on what you heard, what you're going to reflect on, why you appreciate the feedback or the information, and how you may have caused harm. All right, let's keep it moving, y'all. We're still unpacking this allyship. So we've talked about this before, but the reason why it's important for us to acknowledge harm, and sometimes we have to do it quickly in context of what we're doing or what we're talking about, but also making sure we do that acknowledging of harm in a way that is authentic, right? One of the things I want to talk about is not leaning into labels, because it can create a binary around the conversation around who's racist and who's not racist. Okay? And so when we think about our society, it's very popular when we talk about folks who are not racist to assume that they hold these titles. We're assuming that they may be progressive, well-meaning, anti-racist, northern, Democrat, moderate, open-minded, or educated. Sometimes when we see folks in community or we're talking to people and they say that these things, we're saying, surely they're not racist. Surely they're not, right? Why is it a problem for us to think that people are not racist or wanting to folks not to call us racist by adopting these labels? Why are these labels?
I think one of the biggest issues is you could use them as an excuse for inaction. So if you say, oh, I'm educated or I'm progressive, therefore it's like an excuse to go back to that actor position.
Yeah, somebody else.
Because they're masks that people can hide behind.
And so the idea here is that allies don't wear labels to affirm that they're actually allies. Right? Remember, we're still talking about that, constant intent over impact. Even the term ally. When we get done today, I want you to know the function of an ally, an actor, and an accomplice. I don't need you to walk around going, today I became an accomplice. Nope. We don't want to do that either, right? It's good to have the language to describe maybe a stance on something, but when it comes to racism and unpacking racism, we can never use a term to really do that work. That's going to be a lifelong work. And so contrastly, someone may say, we know you're a racist because you are an older person, because you're from the South. Oh, you're closed-minded. Yep. You're a Trump supporter. You're ignorant. You're bigoted. You're prejudiced. You're an alt-right. Remember these labels. And so now what we're doing is we're saying all of those people are racist. Okay? Why is it a problem for us to assume or label people who are racist these things?
Because people can use it as an excuse, kind of, where they're like, oh, this person is racist and they're ignorant or they're like uneducated, so that's why they are. I can't do anything. It's kind of just like an excuse for like the actor mindset.
Now we're categorizing ourselves. Sometimes we say to ourselves, Samantha, we'll say, at least I'm not like them. Right? At least I didn't storm the Capitol. Well, yeah, you raise hell at work every day because you don't recognize the biases you hold or the prejudice you have, right? Like, okay, you don't have to storm a Capitol. There's some other spaces and places that you completely overtake with your white supremacy without even recognizing it. And so sometimes we find a group to say we're not like, and then we say, ooh, at least I'm not like them. Ooh, at least I ain't got that much work to do. Not cool. Why else is it not cool to label all races those things? How can it become a trap?
Well, I think it like separates people, like, for example, like older people. Like it's kind of a little bit, I don't know if ageist is the word, but like
it could be, yeah.
Yeah, like and so older people might be like, to think that like if they get the message that they just can't be not racist because they're old or something, like they can fall back on that excuse and be like, well, that was just the way I was raised. I'm old. That means I can't unlearn this. So
yeah, or because I'm older, I ain't gonna waste my time learning all this new stuff with these young folks, right? Some folks have that attitude as well too. Yeah, this definitely comes from this conversation of not letting racism become a moral debate is critical. Right. And the reason why they're green and red is because sometimes we'll say a racist is bad and a non-racist is a good. Like, no, we're not moralizing racism either. Because what happens is you feel less obligated to dismantle the system because you're focused on the people that either benefit from the system. Okay? We're trying to get rid of racism, not just be considered a good person. Good people can have racist ideas. People who have committed crimes cannot be racist, right? There's not a label that you want to share. Instead, we want to do this. We want to understand that the beauty of anti-racism, not being racist, but anti-racism, is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Right? You don't have to pretend that it doesn't exist in you, that you have not been impacted by it, that you have not internalized racism. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. Okay, you'll also find this quote in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist as well. But yeah, so this is so powerful that I think allies are committing themselves to saying, listen, I am not about grouping folks together according to labels. I'm about really understanding that I got to fight racism wherever I find it, including in myself. That's the goal of an ally, right? And coming to that is going to be critical because now we can say, once we get that understanding, we can stop being so concerned with trying to label ourselves certain things. Okay? Here's another reason why labels are so problematic. Because when we talk about overt versus covert racism, allies really understand that overt racism is something, there's a lot more ways to be covertly racist than overt racism, right? And so overt racism could be hiring discrimination, hate crimes, lynching, racial slurs, police violence, particularly against communities of color, discriminatory lending, right, in the housing market, whitewashing history, neighborhoods, all that kind of stuff is overt. We can clearly look at that and go, nobody will like it if we did it. It's socially unacceptable or not cool in most places if it happened. That's overt. It's out loud. It's obvious, right? But there's far more examples of people who are doing this covert racism, but because they may wear a label, they don't think it's so bad. So for example, celebrating colonialized holidays, right? That's a thing, right? In a way that celebrates colonialization as opposed to really highlighting the harm it has caused to folks who have been colonialized, right? Eurocentric curriculums. They're fighting for that right now in legislation in different states, taking out the word slavery, trying to figure out how to downplay the impact that it has had on Africans, right? All of that kind of stuff. And folks may say, well, I don't think it's a conversation for people in 8th grade. And so they may lean into that, not recognizing that actually feeds generational misunderstandings about history and racism, right? Supporting oppressive policies. Many policies folks just support because of whatever reason, and they may not realize how that policy impacts marginalized communities, right? That's covert. It is that ignorance that plays a part, right? And the point I'm making here is that allies are going below the surface, really mining all the many ways they may be covertly attaching themselves to or buying into things that are actually having negative impacts on communities of color, right? Allies go below that surface and they're saying, wow, what am I doing, right, to contribute to some of those covert ways in which racism manifests itself that I may not be thinking about. Any questions or thoughts about this covert versus overt? All right, let's move on. We're going to move to, this is going to be in your reflection journal, some more quotes from Martin Luther King. We're going to move over to these, and then we'll talk about the rest of the conversation around being an accomplice. So when we talk about and engagement examples of allies, here's some ways in which allies may do it. In community, they may encourage white people in your personal life to participate in racial justice training activities and demonstrations, okay? And the first one, we mentioned that white folks may just talk to other people that agree with them. But now it's not about if you agree. Now it's about if you're in my life, I'm going to expose you to some of those trainings, those activities, and those demonstrations, which goes right back in line with the definition of allies going to trainings and using it as a great starting point. Money, donating continuously to organizations with the racial justice mission, led by directly impacted individuals and support activists, okay? So this may say, listen, you find a couple of organizations nationally, locally, whatever, that you want to continuously invest in. Why? Because their mission Not only do they just use the words, but they're actually actively doing these things, contributing to a larger vision for racial equity. And they may be led by directly impacted individuals, right? They may be led by folks who are from the community they're trying to serve, right, in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And you want to know if they support activists. Maybe they're the ones who are bailing folks out when they get arrested because they're doing protests or something like that. You want to really make sure you understand that and really start to put your money in places like that. Protesting. Attending protest demonstrations and resistance movements that force people with power and privilege, right? Remember before we talked about attending them when they seemed comfortable to you or, in some way? Nah. Now as an ally, you're like, listen, is this thing gonna really make somebody uncomfortable? I'm trying to disrupt, like Martin Luther King said, that status quo. When it comes to education, attending trainings and studying information about white privilege and historically oppressed to gain greater knowledge, right? Now we're really moving into just being like, not only do I know it, but I want to understand what's happening. Advocacy, attending meetings, hearings, and other public events in person, right? At first, we were just talking about sharing statuses, which is fine, but anybody can do that from the comfort of their own home. Now, as an ally, you want to show up to places and places where these things are happening and lending your voice, okay? Time and volunteering. Volunteer at local racial justice-focused organizations or coordinating volunteers for racial justice initiatives, okay? Intervening, right? Now we're looking at the workplace, at home. Are you intervening microaggressions, right? And harassments amongst white folks and or allies may even film police brutality. At first you may look at it, but now you may film that to make sure you can get on documentation what's happening, right? And you've seen a lot of police officers saying, don't film me, put their cameras down. Some folks have even passed ordinances and laws against filming police officers, but in certain states, you can still do that and it's a legal right. Art. Purchasing, consuming, and sharing art created by people of color that celebrate Black culture, educate others about racism. And so now it isn't just, did Jeremy make it because he's Black, but it's, what does this art mean? How is it contributing to the consciousness of folks who look at it? How is it celebrating that culture? Jobs. Using your job position to talk about diversity, using your job position to talk about diversity. Encourage infinity groups, recruit diverse hires, and interrupt interpersonal bias amongst colleagues. Now you're saying no matter what position I'm in, I'm going to be focused on making sure there is diversity, right? We're having conversations. We're recruiting new folks. Hey, come work here. It's a great place to be if it truly is for folks who are diverse, right? And even saying, listen, we're going to interrupt that bias. Politics, volunteering, canvassing for and or donating to campaigns of progressive people of color, running for a political office. And remember, not just because they're progressive by label, but they really are thinking about what the future of some of these issues are, and they're doing that work to make sure they can bring folks along in that conversation, right? It's not just voting for them, but we're literally volunteering and giving our time. Taking children to events. We talked about reading to them. I told you, we can go even deeper. You can even take them to the events where adults are speaking about racism and having conversations with them about white supremacy culture. I told y'all it's going to get deeper, right? Making those books make more sense in context of life, right? Really exposing them to those conversations. And then at home, sometimes you can make your home available to organizers who need safe, accessible, and welcoming spaces to meet, plan, and act. Okay, so it's more than just saying you support Black Lives Matter with the sign, but maybe you can say, hey, y'all, you can use my home space on the weekends to really do some of that work to figure out how you're going to disrupt and agitate. Okay, so remember, like I said before, I'm not saying these things as an actor should not be done. I'm saying the reason why you do them matters as much as what you do. And these take us another step further. We go a little bit deeper in doing these things in a way where we can physically be present to make an impact. Okay? Any of these stand out to you or challenge you or you have questions about? All right. And then lastly, we're going to talk about what it means to be an accomplice. Someone please read the first part of the definition of accomplices.
I can read it for you.
Go ahead, Luca.
While one may hear accomplice and think about crime, the original meaning of the word conveys a sense of cooperation, and not in a criminal sense. In a social justice context, accomplice speaks to a sense of community or folding together.
Good stuff. Thank you. Someone new. Red.
An accomplice will focus more on dismantling the structures that oppress that individual or group, and such work will be directed by the stakeholders in the marginalized group.
Good. And lastly,
allies work to push us toward the safety and dignity of marginalized populations in the present moment. Accomplices work at the structural level will take a long view to destroy oppressive social structures and create a more equitable world.
Wow. Somebody tell me, what do you appreciate about this definition of an accomplice?
Well, it says it in the quote, but I appreciate that it says that it's a long view, like they're invested in the long-term structural change rather than like the present moment.
Yeah, that's good. Someone else?
That the work will be directed by the stakeholders in the marginalized group. So it's not just like you're going out and doing what you think you should be doing, but you're like listening to what others, like the work that others have been saying needs to be done.
Somebody else. Thank you, Samantha.
I like how it shifts it from kind of interpersonal to more institutional work.
Yeah, so Constance, you're noticing that we're graduating, right? Being an ally is definitely about the interpersonal work, and accomplice is truly structured in saying, listen, where's these institutions and how can we dismantle them? Here's what Martin Luther King had to say about accomplices. He says, you express, speaking to white folks who are moderate or actors, a great deal of anxiety over our willingness. Now he's talking about him and other white folks who are accomplices, over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I will be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Martin Luther King. These are the quotes that folks don't like to share. Okay. Why did white and privileged people get anxious over resistance movements breaking laws? Okay. Why do you all think white folks and privileged folks get anxious about other folks breaking laws? Anybody?
Probably because those laws were put in place to protect those white people. So now they're like, oh, like now they want to break these laws that are meant to protect me. So what's going to happen? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks who, when it comes to the law, statistically, it works more in their favor at a population level than it does if they were a person of color. And so they're not recognizing that just because the law is by privilege working for you doesn't mean that it is working for other folks. That's good. Why would Dr. King consider an unjust law not a law at all? Anybody? Or is it self-explanatory? And then lastly, how can Dr. King's words help us define what it means to be an accomplice? How can his words help us define what it means to be an accomplice? Somebody?
I think kind of just going off of this, his definition, or like to help define accomplice, would be people who are willing to disobey unjust laws and just sort of point light on the fact that they're unjust.
That's good. Somebody else, at least one more person in the chat box. The quote reminds me of the term vigilantes to stand up and be a voice and not afraid to speak out. Yeah. One of the things he's talking about here is when you break a law, most folks recognize that you're also risking your well-being, right? And that's critical. Folks who are really willing to risk their physical well-being, their jobs, all of those things are necessary for change. Remember, folks of color have been doing it for years, right? If white folks want to be an accomplice, you have to be able to do that work as well, okay? All right, y'all, to close us out, I want to move us toward, there's a Black woman called Leslie Mac23 on Instagram. She shared this about what it means when Martin Luther King talks about breaking laws. Well, she talks about, here's some wisdom when it comes to action, okay? In the coming days, weeks, and months, you will be promoted to take action for justice. While we are called to take action, when we take action, it is critical, and how we take action really matters, especially in times like these. So here's some things I want you all to consider. And I'll put this in your guidebook too. Who is the source? When you think about taking action, y'all, really partnering with folks of color in this work, where did you hear about the action? Who's planning it, running it, or calling it? Have you ever heard of them before? And are they Black organizers? What's the intent? It's about that org training. Is this a performative action? Meaning, is it just to be seen? What or who is the target? Who are we going after here? What's the goal? And is it useful to Black organizers? Who benefits from the action? Okay? Questions you may not have thought to ask yourself. Will this damage current efforts of Black organizers? Will this silence Black voices? Will this amplify Black organizing goals? Remember, these are some questions most folks are not used to asking, and they're intentional to make you go deeper, right? If you're going to be an accomplice, you also have to know, like we said about the allies, you got to know when your actions are really moving things forward and it has the potential to move things backwards. And be okay with the fact that you're going to make some mistakes. That's a part of the journey. But here's some great questions to always ask yourself. And maybe before you join, you may inbox somebody on Facebook or Twitter and say, hey, y'all, who's organizing this, right? Who's our target? And you may now get a better understanding of why they're doing the work that they're doing, right? So it's important to not just do the work, but understand all the dynamics of that work as well. And as you continuously do that accomplished work, you'll get better and better at doing this as well. All right, y'all, to close us out with 2 minutes left. And these are going to be in your reflection journal, but I really want to share with you all how accomplices approach all 12 of these actions, okay? In community, they do, and I want to say this, accomplices do everything we talked about and what I'm going to say right now, okay? All of that and some, okay? Another example is to take down monuments that celebrate historic racism and dedicate public spaces and buildings to BIPOC histories, right? Really beginning to say, look, this community is missing a lot of that history that is holistic. When it comes to Native Americans, when it comes to African Americans, let's begin to make our community reflect that actual history that it deserves and stop only prioritizing the history of racism potentially. Money. Find ways of using your privilege and access to capital and funnel that to Black and Brown Indigenous grassroots organizations and peoples. Engage and or support civil disobedience organized by Black people and people of color. Use your privilege to protect those activists. Organize other white people to study these issues together and advocate for historically accurate racial justice studies in schools. Okay, support racial justice organizations with drafting policies, contacting elected officials to advocate for legislation that directly impact BIPOC communities. Join an organization with an explicit aim of naming and disrupting racial justice and dismantling white supremacy. Intervening, physically intervene policy or police policy violence. And so what that means is there's some violence that happens not just for police officers, but actually the policies, like policies that protect officers unequivocally if they kill somebody. Intervene that as well, right? Figure out ways to dismantle those policy violence, hold organizations accountable to diversity, and support healing spaces for marginalized groups. When it comes to art, organize and fund opportunities for people from directly impacted communities to share their art via large platforms, right? Don't just buy art, but actually help invest in other artists who can use that opportunity. Risk your job to hold your employer accountable to making sustainable changes for equity and racial justice. Politics. Organize white communities to support progressive, radical politicians and policies. Children. Explicitly work with children to use racial justice language. Advocate for equity and unlearn white supremacy culture. And then at home, provide free housing to activists, organizers, and educators of color. Work to ensure BIPOC communities are welcomed, purchase and rent homes in your community, right? And so we know that the housing market is oftentimes redlined. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel just came out with a report related to how white houses are selling 3 times higher than Black houses, and that contributes to low property value and historical redlining that often happens with communities of color. So you got to be able to say, listen, let me make an impact on that as well. All right. All right, so that is what we have for our 2-hour training today. Thank you all for your time. Thank you all for staying with us for the duration of these last 9 months. And hopefully you all have found something that you can use to help make your community better, grow yourself as someone doing this work as well. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for joining, everybody. We just want to say once again how much we appreciate Jeremy doing these sessions for us this year. Jeremy, thank you again, and thank you all for putting in the work and coming to these sessions throughout over these last several months.